I suspect that we'll continue to have some people trickling in while we go, but welcome everyone. I think let's go ahead and get started. First off, I want to thank everyone for giving up your lunch hour to join us this afternoon. It's great to see so many folks here to learn more about farmland ownership and farmland stewardship. Before I jump into my spiel, I just want to say I put a message in the chat here. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us your name, where you live, if and where you own farmland. We would love to learn a little bit more about who is attending. My name is Jorgen Rose. I'm a program coordinator with Practical Farmers of Iowa. And I am gonna kick us off here with some introductory materials and some housekeeping items before I turn it over to our speakers to handle the good stuff that you all came here to hear. So first off, this workshop is a collaboration between 4 organizations: the Moines Water Works, Heartland Cooperative, People's Company, and Practical Farmers of Iowa. And I think you'll find that this is a pretty unusual partnership between very different organizations. And I think that this just really speaks to the importance of the topic at hand: thoughtful and intentional farmland management. So I hope you enjoyed this workshop series. It is not like anything that we here at Practical Farmers have ever done before. So it's a learning curve for all of the partners. I think we'll be interested to hear what you think. I'm going to let each organization introduce themselves over the next couple of workshops as we hear from each of them directly. But I did just want to share about a bit about Practical Farmers right up front. So we are a farmer and landowner-led organization working across Iowa and in surrounding states to build resilient farms and communities. We do that in a few different ways. We offer financial assistance and technical assistance for things like cover crops to farmers and landowners interested in those conservation practices. We also facilitate a whole range of field days and events and workshops like this one. And then we also work with farmers to conduct on-farm research. So you can learn more by visiting practicalfarmers.org, or you can always drop me an email. The goal in planning this workshop series was to provide some information and context for landowners who are interested in learning more about farmland management and farmland stewardship. And so the theme for today's workshop is Every Farm Matters. And this is our first workshop. And so we're really laying the groundwork today for the sessions to follow. So we hope you continue to join us over the next few weeks. Also, please feel free to share info about this workshop with others. They can always join at any time. You don't have to have started at the beginning. These workshops will also be recorded, so you should feel free to send those recordings along and folks can catch up as they go. So I promise in just a couple minutes, I'm going to turn things over to our first speaker, Lisa Moran, who is a chemist with the Des Moines Water Works, and so that we can learn a little bit more about watersheds. And then later on, we will hear from Chris Henning, a landowner from Cooper, Iowa, and Ted Corrigan, CEO of Des Moines Water Works, and Molly Aronowitz, who is with People's Company. But I just need a few minutes here to take care of a few more housekeeping items. First off, Megan, maybe we can publish that poll. And so we just want to know a little bit more about kind of our baseline of our audience here today. So if you want to take a few minutes and answer this poll while I'm covering the rest of my items, and then we'll review the results here. So I just want to provide a little bit of info about how we're going to handle Q&A and discussion and some of the Zoom tools we'll be using. So throughout the presentations, you should always feel free to use the chat box either to make comments, ask questions, ask for clarification. If those questions are quick and easy clarifying questions, and if it's not too disruptive, we may ask them during or immediately after each speaker's presentation. We are more likely, though, to hold on to any of those questions until the end of today's workshop. And we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion at the end. So if we don't, if you type a question in the chat and we don't get to it right away, don't worry, we haven't forgot about you. We will keep track of those questions and we'll do our best to get them all answered. When you do ask a question or type, you'll see here this to box in the chat. Make sure that is set to everyone, not just to the host. We want to make sure that everyone sees our comments and discussion. During our Q&A period at the end, we'll also invite folks to unmute and ask questions verbally if you prefer. You can either indicate your desire to ask a question verbally in the chat, or if you click on the participants tab, you should be able to find a raise hand button. If you click that button, then we'll know you want to ask a question verbally. Until the Q&A period, though, we're going to do our best to keep everyone muted just so we don't disturb our speakers. So don't take it personally if we mute you. This workshop is really for all of you. So whether you type or speak your questions, I want to encourage you all to stay engaged, ask questions, participate in discussion. I think you'll find that this will be a lot more fun, a lot more engaging, and a lot more useful if you do that. Also remember to please stay respectful. So we've got a pretty broad audience here today. Chances are we've all got different views on a range of subjects. And I don't think anyone in this virtual room will claim to have all the answers. I know I certainly do not, but I think that between us all, we certainly have a lot of the right questions, and that should be more than enough. And lastly, at the conclusion of this workshop series, in about a month or so, everyone who registered for at least one of these workshops is going to receive an email with a link to take an evaluation for practical farmers. So we would really appreciate it if you would please take a few minutes with that eval to tell us how we did with this workshop. We really want to make these programs and these educational opportunities useful to you all, and the evals are the primary way that you can tell us what worked and what didn't. So please take a few minutes and fill out that evaluation when it comes here in the next few weeks. So before I turn things over to Lisa, I think, Megan, let's go ahead and publish the poll and see what folks said. Interesting. So most of you indicated that you are not comfortable or somewhat comfortable with farmland management decision making. Very few of you indicated that you are very comfortable. So hopefully over the next few weeks, over these workshops, we can try and pump those numbers up a little bit. All right. So that's all my housekeeping. I am going to turn things over to Lisa, who is she's a chemist with the Moines Water Works, to lay some groundwork for us about watersheds. So I'm going to stop sharing.
And I will start sharing.
Perfect.
Are we seeing that okay?
It looks great.
Great. Hey, hi everyone. Like Jorgen said, I am a chemist with Des Moines Water Works. And I just want to say we at Des Moines Water Works are really excited to partner with Heartland Co-op, Practical Farmers of Iowa, and People's Company for this workshop. It's something a little bit different for us, and that is always fun. So I'm here today to talk about watersheds and why what happens on your land matters not only to you, but to those around you and those far away from you as well. So I'll talk a little bit about the brief overview of watersheds, and then later you'll be able to hear from our CEO from Des Moines Water Works, Ted Corrigan, who will tell you more about how we specifically treat drinking water and why land management really matters to us. Okay, so what's a watershed? A watershed is an area of land that drains all the streams and rainfall to a common outlet. So everyone lives in a watershed. Watersheds come in all different sizes. The largest one in the United States is the Mississippi River Basin, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Drains into the Gulf of Mexico. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the Gulf Hypoxia Zone. That's an example of a large impact from a huge land area. So all the water that flows through Iowa eventually ends up in the Gulf of Mexico, whether it goes straight to the Mississippi from our rivers here in the state or over to the Missouri and then into the Mississippi, it all ends up down there. So we in Iowa are having an effect as far away as the Gulf. Now that's a big effect. Watersheds come in all sizes though. This is a common use of measurement among watershed scientists. It's called a hydrologic unit code. These are the major river basins in Iowa, or the hydrologic unit code. They call them 8s. There's different sizes. So these are the big river basins in Iowa. We can also take one of those big watersheds and break it down to even smaller ones. If any of you are from Northeast Iowa, this is the Turkey River watershed. This is one of those watersheds from the last map, broken down to even more tiny watersheds. So I tell you all of this because I want you to start thinking about what your watershed address is. It's really important to understand that we can have impacts at many different levels. So I like to think of it as kind of an address system. Say I lived at the state capitol, which I don't, but the state capitol, living at the state capitol would be the equivalent of saying Sailor Creek is your address. That's the little watershed that's closest to the state capitol. Then you can go a step higher and say, oh, I live in the middle Des Moines River watershed. That's equivalent to saying, oh, I live in Des Moines. Go a step higher, saying you live in the Des Moines River watershed is a large watershed. It's like saying I live in central Iowa. Then you could go further, the upper Mississippi River watershed is like living in the state of Iowa. And again, the Mississippi River watershed is just like saying you live in the United States. So we want to think on multiple levels here. You know, you think about your impacts locally most, like, oh, I have an impact in my neighborhood, I have an impact. You can kind of see that more clearly. But what we really want to think about is not only those impacts in your local area and neighborhood, but as you move further up into larger watersheds, you're still having impacts, and those cumulative impacts can affect a lot of people. So one of the reasons we're so interested in watersheds here at Des Moines Water Works is that we use water from the Raccoon River and the Des Moines River that we treat and use for drinking water. So we have two rather large watersheds that drain to us, and we have all the impacts of those watersheds. So Des Moines Water Works is the largest drinking water utility in Iowa with around 500,000 customers. We come from a variety of areas. We have, of course, the urban customers in Des Moines and then all the surrounding suburbs. And then we also have rural customers. We supply water to a number of rural water networks. Unlike much of the drinking water utilities in Iowa, we are a surface water utility, so we use water that is coming directly off the land. And what's interesting about that is the watersheds that we use are the Raccoon River and the Des Moines River, and they are predominantly row crop agriculture. So this is land cover in the Raccoon River watershed. You see the light white and kind of tan areas, those are corn and soybeans. So about 76% of the Raccoon River watershed is row crop. So what's happening on that land in that big of a percentage has an impact on what we're seeing in the river. Watersheds are really, really important to us because all of the stuff that's washing off comes to us, and then we have to figure out ways to treat for it. So we see things like high nitrates in the spring that come from those row crop fields, especially through tile drainage. We see things like large amounts of nutrients in the rivers, which can lead to cyanobacterial growth. Those cyanobacteria can release toxins into the water, and that's something we're particularly concerned with as a drinking water utility, and something Ted will discuss in much more detail. This is Saylorville Lake, again, just upstream from us on the Des Moines River. Though that is a cyanobacteria bloom, these were taken in 2014 and 2020. We're seeing similar things this year as well, but that's just upstream with us. Saylorville collects a large area of land that drains into it. It sits there, can create these cyanobacteria blooms, and that is again just upstream with us from us. That water is released into the Des Moines River, and we see issues with that. So this year we have seen detectable levels of cyanotoxins, specifically microcystin, in the Des Moines River for multiple days. We have occasionally also seen detectable levels of microcystin in the Raccoon River. So this is a major concern for us, kind of a new and emerging thing that you haven't heard about maybe as much as some of the other things like nitrate that we are more accustomed to treating in our water. So again, I want you to think about your watershed address. I want you to think about what's happening on the land you own or the land you farm, and are there ways to lessen impacts, not only locally in your local little stream that runs through or local river that goes through, but all of that water flows somewhere. Whether you may not be concerned about the Gulf of Mexico, because that is very far away, one thing you can think about is what's going on just in our state as a whole. What are the impacts that are happening to people downstream of you, such as, selfishly us at Des Moines Water Works, because it takes a lot of effort to treat the water and remove a lot of these things that are harmful and are regulated by our regulatory agency, and make sure we have safe, reliable drinking water for our customers. With that, I will ask if there are any brief questions. I know that was just a quick overview of watersheds, but we really want to get the idea of thinking downstream is one of our major mottos. You see it on our logo here, because everything that is going on in those watersheds is affecting us. And whether it be us, if you're in the Raccoon or Des Moines River watershed or somewhere else, the things that happen on the landscape do affect others downstream. Thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you, Lisa. We do have a couple of minutes for questions. So Marty in the chat asks if you can post where to find those watershed maps. If you have a link to a website to help find a watershed, if we could share it in the chat, that would be great. Any other quick questions for Lisa? All right. Well, if you think of any questions for Lisa, she's going to stick around. She'll be here for a Q&A and discussion. So feel free to put those into the chat or hold on to them to our discussion, and we will get those answered. Our next presenter will be Chris Henning. Chris is a landowner from Cooper, Iowa in Greene County. She asked me to pull some photos. I don't know if she's going to be happy with the picture I picked of her. If I can get my screen shared again. There we go. It was pretty windy, if you couldn't tell this day.
Not only was it windy, but that's my COVID haircut.
All right, Chris. Chris is gonna, now that we've heard from Lisa about what a watershed is, kind of a technical definition, Chris is gonna illustrate for us what it means to her as a landowner to be part of a watershed. So take it away, Chris.
Thanks, Jorgen. Thanks everybody for being here today. It's really fun to see that my neighbor down the road is also on this call, besides some of the others of you that I know. So I'm a landowner and farm manager and actually a crop share farmer, which is quite unusual in Iowa these days. This land that you're looking at in the picture is the original farm that my husband and I bought in 1991. And it had a house. Yeah, anyway, it probably should never have been farmed. And Max was excited because he thought he was going to make 5% on his money. And I was excited to have a house to redo. But I was in charge of the farming because I grew up around the corner from here. And I knew all about farming, right? I left after high school and I was never, ever coming back. And now I've been here 30 years and you couldn't pry me out of here with the farmer skid loader, okay? Just for a little bit of thought about where it is on the watershed. We're in that Raccoon River watershed, and that bluff that you see in the back of this picture is that river bluff. So I'm a mile from the river, and Chris Jones told me at one time, Chris Jones used to work at Des Moines Water Works. He's over at University of Iowa now. Anyway, he told me it was 3 days from my farm down the 85 miles of river. It's about 60 if you do it by road, to Des Moines. Jorgen, maybe you want to share that picture for a minute. The Des Moines picture. I lived 30
you
years.
keep talking, Kristen. I'll find that photo.
Okay. I lived 30 years before this, worked at Meredith and so forth. and lived on the Walnut Creek, which is half a mile from the river at 63rd and Grand in West Des Moines, or Des Moines, either way you talk about it. And anyway, I sold that sold that property to move to this farm. Jorgen's pictures are from 1973 flood, and the 1993 flood was like 5 times, 10 times, whatever you want to count it, more than the flood of 93, which happened the second year that I lived here. July the 8th, we had 8 inches of rain, and there you go. This is 1973 in Des Moines, in my front yard in Des Moines. My kids, who are now 52 and 53, and I don't even remember what age that Hornet was, but anyway, our cars backing out into the street, looking toward what was then the Plantation Drive-In, and so forth and so on, what now has levees and all sorts of things. When in the flood of 1993, we had 8 inches of rain in Greene County, in my area in Jefferson. I was at the county fair. It kind of looked like this at the county fair that day when I went to get in my car. And you see the, I think it's the Dodge Rambler, but anyway, you see it hitting the floorboards of the car. Well, that day, 8 inches of rain in Jefferson was inside my car. I came home to what looked like Big Creek, up the valley to the west of me, and I have a creek both to the north and to the south. In the morning, I had no road either on the north or the south, and 3 days later, you had no water in the waterworks that you could pump out because you were swamped with the flood of 93. Well, that's when I learned in a big way. And now we can go back to the picture, Jorgen, of where we are now, because this picture was taken last fall. What I do on this farm makes a difference to what happens downstream and to 500,000 people, lots of whom I still know, still see. My daughter still lives there. The guy in the house where I lived, I don't know. It's changed hands several times. But in 93, he had water, not just in his yard, but to the floorboards of the kitchen. The basement was full. That has a big impact on somebody who's trying to learn how to farm, learn what to do, and so forth and so on. And in this photo, you can see what we did first. And I don't know, Jorgen, can you give me control of the cursor?
Probably not.
Okay, so run it.
Try.
Okay, you can run your cursor along the edge of the cover crop and show that buffer strip. The trees in the foreground here are along a creek. There are 4 creeks on this farm. All of them feed the river. And I'm the bottom part of 3 sections of land, a very, very small watershed that feeds the raccoon through these creeks. Okay, so that buffer strip was on all four creeks, 100 foot on both sides of every creek. And it's prairie, and prairie in 10 feet stops silt from going over ground. It also puts water down in the roots. And the root system filters water before it actually gets in the creek. Not all of the people upstream from me, in fact, very few of the people upstream from me have cover crops or buffer strips. And the strange part of this creek business is at least the one that divides this picture horizontally, that one midpoint before the river bluff, that set of trees, is on what was tiled land at one time. So when you tile, over time, if the water runs over it and runs over it and runs over it, because not all of it will ever get in a tile, it carries the soil away and pretty soon you have a gully. In 93, the water went so fast that new gullies formed and you could lose a John Deere in it. And believe me, I almost did. Okay. You get out there looking to see what you've got and the grass is tall, and yeah, it's a scary kind of thing. At one time, well, I don't plant my own cover crops. I did plant these buffer strips because I was really interested in that. They've been there, we're into the second 10 years of a CRP program for buffers. The cover crops in the foreground, we started paying attention to cover crops. This is cover crop on what was corn. 2 years ago, what is corn again now, but was soybean last year. And you see the stubble is all there. You see even in the foreground, the mud, this little bit of mud is not just mud. You can see kind of how it washes even in the field, even with cover crop. So you can imagine what it looks like if you don't use cover crops. So since 2008, this farm, the half of it, the 145 acres start with, half of it, less than half of it now, is actually cropped with corn and soybeans in a rotation. And since 92, the yields on this farm have gone from scary low soybean yields to actual respectable yields of maybe 50 bushels an acre. The corn yields went from 100 to close to 180. Okay. And one of the things that I learned later when I inherited land from my dad, that is more flat and further away from the river, thankfully. Although one piece of it has a farm pond that drains like this, through land like this, and comes from other farmers' runoff. Anyway, that land is less in CRP, but I didn't learn about yields going up when you take land out of production until I inherited a piece from my dad. We don't have pictures of it, but it is a flat piece of land that was a lake. In 1915, it was drained the lake was drained for the railroad. And the railroad went at the time from Des Moines to Jefferson and on to Spirit Lake, kind of following that same route that the stagecoaches used to use to go along the river and then north and northwest. Anyway, that lake bottom had places that were, well, they were gray like cement. they were dead. They were dead. They didn't have any organic matter in them. And this pond turned out to be a farmable wetland, or that they had tried to farm, about 10 acres, that 5 out of the 6 years prior to my father's dying and whatever, had not been able to raise a crop. And convincing the farmer that we were going to take it out of production took some doing. But what we found is that by taking 10 acres out of production that was doing nothing, growing nothing, costing us money for seed, chemicals, time, whatever, actually increased the value and the yield of the field by dividing the number of acres and into the yield. And I've had 200 bushel corn on that farm since. And the soybeans this year after a derecho look like they might do good, even though we had to kill oodles and oodles of volunteer corn that the derecho planted last year. Working with my farmer, I ride the combine with him. I often ride the planter, or at least I'm out there taking pictures with him. And we talk about what we're going to do and whatever. My best advice for other landowners who aren't really involved is to get to know your farmer and learn what he sees so that you know what your land is doing. And that's what I try to do every year. I'm taking pictures all year long. I'm working with the farmer. He was here yesterday. We're talking about what's happening right now with the drought. Being a neighbor to my land. It would be hard to live in Oklahoma or to live in Des Moines and do this kind of thing. I'm just happy I'm here, even though I don't live on all my land or it's not all contiguous. But I'm going to wrap up now. If you have questions now or later, I'd be happy to help. And I'm always up for a tour. So just give a holler if you want to see it.
Well, thank you, Chris. That was great. I think we have maybe 1 minute for a quick question if there's any questions for Chris. Otherwise, she'll be around during our Q&A and discussion. Chris referenced, her one piece of advice is to get to know your renter. And I think that some of our later on workshops down the road will cover some tactics and strategies for how to do that in depth. So if you're interested in learning more about how to do that, I recommend that you attend some of our later workshops as well. So I think I will turn things over to Ted. I will stop sharing. And Ted can tell us in some more detail about how to think downstream and how to be kind downstream. Ted, is that the terminology?
Yeah, Jordan, thank you for that introduction. Let me see if I can get the technology to work for me here, and you tell me if you're seeing the right side of things here.
I think we got to swap the display again.
Swap the display again. Okay. How's
There we
that
go.
looking?
Looks perfect.
Okay. Yeah. Jordan, thank you. Thank you to everyone who's taken the time here today. As Jordan mentioned, my name is Ted Corrigan. I'm the CEO and General Manager here at Des Moines Water Works. And we are so pleased to see a group of folks here today who are interested in potentially implementing, learning more about things you've already implemented, sustainable conservation practices on your land. I want to thank Jordan and Practical Farmers Heartland Co-op. I think Ruth McCabe has been kind of the lead there, Molly and the folks at Peoples. And I also want to thank Jennifer Terry here at Des Moines Water Works for their efforts in putting together, I think, what we've called an unusual collaboration on this series, but it's an amazing collaboration, and Des Moines Water Works is really excited about what we've got going on here. My goal today is to share information with you about the water quality situation in the state of Iowa from a drinking water utility perspective. I want to talk about some of the challenges that we face, some of what makes the Iowa drinking water landscape unique. And then I want to talk about some things that hopefully you all as landowners can think about, or things that you should know in terms of improving water quality in the state, providing environmental benefits beyond just improving water quality. I'm going to talk a little bit about protecting public health, and then also just mention protecting your investment. All things that other people are going to talk a lot more about, but things that I think you should know being landowners in the state of Iowa. Recognizing that this is totally from the perspective of a drinking water professional here in Des Moines. So before we get into that, though, I want to give you just a little bit of background about the water quality scene in the state of Iowa and what that means for drinking water utilities. Specifically from a Des Moines Water Works perspective, Lisa mentioned some of this. We're the largest utility in the state. That's not surprising. 500,000 customers receive their drinking water from Des Moines Water Works every day, primarily in this 4-county area. It would be really interesting for me to know how many of you on the call today live in this 4-county area, potentially receive water service from Des Moines Water Works. I saw a couple in the chat already who mentioned that they live in Polk County or live in the Des Moines area but own farmland, and that's a great target audience for us, our customers who are also landowners. So it'd be interesting to pop in the chat if you do live in this area. But fully 1/6 of the state of Iowa's population receives their drinking water from Des Moines Water Works every day. I think that that's important for folks to know that a large percentage of the state of Iowa's population receives their water from surface water sources. The vast majority of the drinking water utilities in the state, more than 90%, I think at last count, are actually groundwater utilities. They get their water from wells, but many of them are smaller. Sometimes people ask, why doesn't Des Moines just use wells? Better protected source. You wouldn't have to worry about all these contaminants. Well, the answer is we just don't have that as an option. The aquifers available to us just don't have the capacity. And so we are, by design, a surface water utility. And that is the case for most of the water utilities in the major metropolitan areas in Iowa. At Des Moines Water Works, we are using direct surface water from either the Des Moines or the Raccoon River, or we are using very shallow groundwater, 30 to 50 feet deep, immediately adjacent to the rivers and streams, very influenced by the quality of the water in the rivers. That's the only option that we really have. And that makes us somewhat unique in Iowa in terms of the drinking water utilities across the state. But it is important to know that most of the large communities in Iowa are using surface water or water that's very much impacted by the quality of the water in the river. It's important to understand that surface waters are impacted, the quality of the surface waters are impacted by what happens on the surface, right? What happens on the surface of the land across the state of Iowa has significant influence on quality of our surface waters here in the state. And what happens on the surface of the land in Iowa? Well, we all know Iowa is an agricultural state. Always has been, always will be. It's the predominant land use across the state, and it does have a significant impact on water quality in the rivers and our experience as a drinking water utility using those rivers and streams for surface water. What goes onto the land as inputs and necessary parts of agricultural production, when it moves through the land and drains through the tiles, becomes contaminants in many cases in the surface waters and things that we have to deal with. So that's One important factor in terms of the water quality landscape in the state of Iowa from a drinking water perspective is agricultural production. Another important factor for us, especially in Des Moines, is tile drainage. The state of Iowa has a lot of tile drainage, and especially on what we call the Des Moines lobe, that very flat, very productive agricultural area in north central Iowa. It happens to be where the two rivers that we use, the Des Moines and the Raccoon, drain. That's where our watersheds are. Lisa showed you that picture. This is actually a map of drainage districts in Iowa, and a drainage district is basically an organization of landowners who get together and build large-scale drainage infrastructure, in many cases because they don't have the opportunity to drain to a creek or a river on their own property because it's so flat. Extensive tile drainage, especially in north central Iowa, and that's important from the water quality landscape in the state of Iowa, because the science tells us that drainage tile has a tendency to short circuit the normal water cycle. So what's applied to the landscape, or rain as it falls on the landscape, moves those things through the soil profile to the tiles, and then very quickly delivers it to the surface water streams and rivers in the state. That's different than a non-tile drain situation where water tends to move through the soil profile and take weeks or even months to get to the surface water. So agriculture, tile drainage, and then of course another important factor for us, especially in north central Iowa, is confined animal feeding. This is a graphic that shows the growth of the confined animal feeding industry over about the last 30 years in the state of Iowa, and you can see there has been significant growth, and significantly when it comes to confined animal feeding, there's manure that needs to be dealt with, and in almost every case, that manure is land applied in close proximity to the facility where it's produced. It's land applied on that same land that's tile drained, has the same opportunity to move through the soil profile into the tiles and out into the surface waters here in the state. So those are some of the things that make the water quality landscape somewhat unique in the state of Iowa compared to other areas of the country. We've got agriculture, we've got tile drainage, we've got animal feeding. So what are the results of those sort of unique circumstances in terms of drinking water experience or drinking water treatment in our experience? Well, one more very important result is that we see a lot of over nutrification or nutrient contamination in our surface waters, specifically nitrate. We've been dealing with nitrate concentrations here at Des Moines Water Works in excess of the drinking water standard for 30 or 40 years. That's not something new. We've all heard a lot about it. We can be assured that in any given year, we are going to see tens of thousands of tons of nitrate flow past each of our intakes on both the Des Moines and the Raccoon River. And that's important because nitrate is a regulated drinking water contaminant. We have to treat for nitrate. And in some instances, the nitrate concentrations in the Des Moines and Raccoon River can be double the drinking water standard. And that can be a big deal for us and very hard for us to treat. Algae blooms are another result of the somewhat unique circumstances we have here on the landscape in Iowa, and they're becoming more and more of a challenge for us. Over the last 30 years, we've started to see algae blooms on all of our surface water, rivers and streams, and especially in lakes and reservoirs across the state. This is a picture, I think it might be the same picture that Lisa showed, of an algae bloom at Saylorville Reservoir that's just getting started. This year, you can see the green tint, you can see the mat starting to form in the foreground of that picture. And that's a real challenge to us because when those algae bloom in great profusion like this, they can also begin to form algal toxins. So not only are the algae themselves a problem, but the algal toxins can be a challenge for us too. And unfortunately, blue-green algae, cyanobacteria, whether or not they're going to produce toxins at any given time or in any given year is kind of hard to predict. We don't always know if the algae is there, whether there's going to be microcystin or not. Microcystin, which is the most commonly detected algal toxin in our situation, is a really bad actor. It's something that can kill livestock or pets if they ingest too much. It can also cause skin irritation, liver issues, even neurological issues, even with fairly small exposure. So it's something that we're very aware of, very careful about. We do extensive testing to monitor for microcystins, specifically in the Des Moines. This is a graph that shows our experience over the last 6 or 7 years. And as you can see, we are starting to see fairly regular spikes in microcystin concentration on the Des Moines River at our intake on almost an annual basis. And if you lay the EPA's drinking water health advisory level over that, you can see that the Des Moines River spends quite a bit of time at or above that level. This is a real concern for us because microcystin can be very hard to remove. And so when we see spikes well above the limit, our best option is really just to avoid that source altogether. When we only have 2 sources, avoiding one of them is a big deal. So that's kind of an overview of the water landscape from a utility perspective, some of the things that make the state of Iowa unique, some of the challenges that we as water utility providers or drinking water providers face. Because of those unique characteristics, we have the nitrate, we have the algae, we have the toxins. What are some of the things that we would like for you to know in terms of land ownership here in the state of Iowa as it relates to the drinking water quality landscape here in the state? Well, first and foremost, I think what we want you to know as landowners in the state of Iowa is that you have the ability as a group to dramatically improve the quality of the surface water sources that we use for drinking water here in the state. We know for a fact that more than 90% of the nitrate in our surface waters, more than 80% of the phosphorus, vast majority of the silt comes off of farmland in the state. We know what it takes to keep that from happening. The nutrient reduction strategy, which is the state's identified policy for improving water quality, is full of practices and options and sound science related to what we can do to improve surface water quality or water quality in general across the state of Iowa. The problem is that the tactics, the processes, the options in the nutrient reduction strategy are not being implemented at a large enough scale or at a fast enough pace to turn the trajectory of water quality. And so we continue to see degradation in surface waters here in the state. Now, we understand that as landowners, if you're not necessarily the operator, you may not be making all of those decisions on a day-to-day or season-to-season basis. But throughout this series, you're going to learn from the experts how you as landowners can potentially influence the decision-making and influence the implementation of those practices on the land. And we hope that we can move in the direction of making a big difference. So the first thing that you need to know is that as landowners, you have tremendous opportunity to improve water quality in the state. Second thing you need to know is that you also have the opportunity to create additional environmental impacts in addition to just simply improving the quality of the water. We know that sediment from erosion, algae blooms driven by nutrient pollution in our surface waters, those two things foul our surface waters. They degrade habitat, they create other environmental problems. But by implementing conservation practices, improving water quality, we can improve habitat, improve diversity, create these environmental benefits. We also know that brown water, slime from algae, the toxins they produce discourage recreation. By improving water quality, you can provide those kind of benefits too. So it isn't just that the water quality will be better, it will be surface waters can be much more of an asset for the state and its residents with improved water quality. The third thing that you need to know from the perspective of a water utility guy anyway, is that you as landowners, as a group, have real potential to protect public health and improve quality of life for Iowans across the state. You've heard a lot about the nitrate concentration issues that we have here in Des Moines, our nitrate removal facilities, the battles that we have on a day in and a day out basis. But all of that might make you think that nitrate concentrations in source waters is just a Des Moines problem, but it really isn't just a Des Moines problem. In fact, there are almost 50 public water supplies across the state that are required by their permit to remove nitrate from their drinking water. There are also hundreds of private wells across the state that regularly exceed the drinking water standard for nitrate. Not only that, but as Lisa mentioned, there's ongoing science that indicates that the current level, or the current maximum level of 10 milligrams per liter might be too high. Even at levels as low as 5 milligrams per liter, there's indication that cancers can be implicated, birth defects, all kinds of other potential health issues. So by improving water quality, reducing those nitrate concentrations in our surface waters, we have the potential to improve public health for all Iowans, not just those using surface waters, but also those using shallow groundwater wells or private groundwater wells. And as I've already mentioned, there are also a lot of quality of life improvements that have potential by improving the quality of the drinking water, by reducing the cost of producing drinking water, even by reducing the flood risks. Chris did a nice job of talking about some of the flooding issues that we experience here in Iowa, and of course by improving recreational opportunities. And the last thing I want to say is that throughout this series, I think you will all see and you'll come to understand that not only can you improve water quality, provide additional environmental benefits, protect public health, and improve the quality of life for all Iowans through implementation of these conservation practices at scale, but you can also protect the investment that you have in your property. And I'm not an expert there. I'm not going to talk about that, but other people are. But I think Chris hit on it when she talked about some of the increases in yield and soil health and all those kind of things. So I think I'll stop there. Obviously, we have big challenges in terms of water quality in the state of Iowa, but we believe that landowners as a group offer big opportunities to provide significant improvement. So, Jorgen, that's what I have. I'll turn it back to you. See if there are any questions immediately.
Thanks very much, Ted. I think we're going to hold on to questions until the end. I did put together a quick poll with your question there about whether or not our attendees received their water from the Moines Water Works, and it looks like about a third of the folks who answered the poll said yes.
Oh, outstanding. Glad to hear that.
Yeah. Great. Well, Ted and Chris both gave us a great lead into our last presenter here, talking about how the things you do to benefit your watershed also can kind of help benefit your bottom line and protect your investment. So I want to introduce Molly Ronowitz. Molly is the Sustainability Director. Is that correct, Molly? You're muted still. Yep. Sustainability Director and Certified Land Manager with People's Company. So she's going to cover that last point that Ted made there.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Jorgen. I'm excited to be a part of the conversation and look forward to hearing what questions come up as we wrap up today's webinar. A typical week in the summer for me looks like visiting farmers, walking fields, writing reports, and communicating with landowners. And as I problem solve with farmers and landowners, I try to find those contractors and expertise that have the solutions to each farm's problems. Icing on the cake is when we can find those cost share dollars for those solutions. In future webinars, we're going to dig deeper into conservation farmland management. In a nutshell, my work is to be the boots on the ground, those eyes and ears of the landowner and I connect the people and then document that work. I also, just really enjoy championing farmland, advocating for the landowner and finding that middle ground to do what's best on each farm. Oops, let's go back here. Okay, so my assignment today is to talk about how stewardship benefits the bottom line. So let's review investment components of farmland. We have short-term cash return and long-term appreciation. So that cash return is typically comes in annual rent. This is your income from the farm. And then appreciation is the increase in value of an asset over time. We've all heard this saying about farmland of they aren't making any more of it. Farmland has historically been a low volatility asset that increases in value over time. Even in the last couple of years with depressed grain markets, we've seen land values remain high due to that supply and demand. If we had, any other real estate asset, would we buy it and then never do maintenance? No. If we owned an apartment complex, over time, we'd have to fix HVAC or resurface a parking lot, etc. We would do ongoing maintenance to that apartment complex to maintain, the integrity and the value of that property. So historically, the industry has, put too much emphasis on maximizing cash rather than maximizing appreciation. It can be short-sighted to focus on cash at a detriment to appreciation, which in the long run can be the greater return component to farmland. So this boils down to asking the question, am I maximizing income and appreciation, or am I maximizing income to the detriment of appreciation? And so when I think about this, it could look like, accepting a top bidder for rent on a farm, but then not following up with that tenant to ensure that they are applying adequate fertilizer. This could be choosing a tenant that will pay top dollar rent, but then won't consider any conservation practices, maybe like no-till or cover crops. How do we measure economic benefit of farmland stewardship as a landowner? Something that I often say, and I'll admit that I stole this from a farmer who told me, is we don't know what we don't measure. Our goal on every farm is to maximize production. Typically, when we collect the data that helps us reach that production goal, the numbers begin to tell a story where input expenses are not equating to bushels harvested. This is often the same acres where we have those environmental issues. So if we can solve the financial issue, there's almost always a positive environmental impact. So landowners and farmers need to think about return on investment over and above thinking about only maximizing yield or maximizing that cash rent. So here's what that looks like. On the pictures to the right of the slide, our first farm here, the northwest corner, which would be outlined in red on the bottom aerial photo, was always wet. Always yield poorly, and then yield maps, which is the top right-hand corner, showed poor yields lined up often with the soils. And you can see the top left-hand image is a soil map. In our soil maps, green is good, red is bad, actually for both the soil and the yield map. So instead of continuing to dump inputs on that northwest corner, we put those acres into a wetland CRP contract and we reduced the tillable acres. Now the overall average yield has increased because we're only farming those most productive acres. Here's another farm example. In this farm, we always knew the northeast corner, which is outlined in red, yielded poor because it was just those lighter soils. This is where the dirt washed and ruts would form in the field. Well, it happened that the tenant's brother had cattle, and so we decided to put the northeast corner into alfalfa, and we entered into a 50-50 crop share lease with the tenant's brother for those alfalfa acres. And again, you know, the average yield has increased after pulling those poor producing acres out of production. So in this case, along with maximizing production on this farm, we improved the farmability. You know, that back corner wasn't fun, you know, for anybody's equipment to get in and out of there and planting, spraying, harvest. And the landowner appreciated having alfalfa surrounding their family pond versus row crop. In both cases, by removing the poor producing acres, we increased yield and in return, increased rent. We were able to find alternative income on those acres that we're taking out of row crop. We were led to this because the tenants shared data with the landowner, and having open communication where maximizing production and protecting those environmentally sensitive acres was made a priority. Okay, so the next point I want to touch on is you know, the important role of the non-farming landowner. And this is a little bit preaching to the choir because if you're participating in this webinar, you're already making a choice to engage. But bear with me, let's follow this for a minute. So with, you know, around 60% of Iowa land rented, too much emphasis is put on farmers and not enough on the landowners. You know, farmers with a one-year lease just don't have the incentive to invest in conservation because they're trying to make money in that 1 year. Conservation is a long game endeavor where each year of conservation practice builds on the previous. So landowners have the power of the lease to incorporate sustainability provisions into their lease and require it. Farmers who want to grow their operation understand that they need to invest in sustainability practices to attract new investor capital. If farmers think they can grow their operation by investing in sustainability, they'll do it. But they can't make money on it in a one-year lease. And what is exciting is that institutional investors are driving environmental key performing indicators as part of financial models. Impact investing is becoming more mainstream, where producing a return is sharing importance with providing economic and environmental impact. We see the future in this on the management side, and we've enrolled all People's Company managed acres in the Leading Harvest Sustainability Standard. In future webinars, we'll get into how we've incorporated a whole suite of environmental governance, social and management practices into our management platform. So when I suggest that landowners get more involved on their rented land, here's some examples. Number one, have a written lease that clearly defines role of landowner and tenant. Include conservation practices with dates and responsibilities listed. As part of that lease, include a reporting requirement. Start collecting data from the tenant that can help direct future decision making. This should include yield maps and fertilizer and chemical application records. What is key to communicate with the tenant is that this data is not requested, to work against the tenant. We're seeking touch points to measure farm production to help lead decision making in the future. It's that we don't know what we don't measure. Number 3, soil test your farm regularly. We suggest every 4 years. This provides an opportunity to check in on available nutrients on the farm and give direction on future fertilizer decision making. And as the tenant provides more data, the landowner-driven soil testing allows the landowner to participate in that back and forth data sharing. And number 4, a landowner can help drive conservation cost share projects. Filling out applications, following up on paperwork, that's not fun for anyone. And this is often an easy task for a landowner to take the lead on to alleviate in-season stress on the tenant. So here's where the rubber hits the road. Topsoil is very difficult to rebuild. When erosion happens on a farm, that topsoil is essentially lost permanently and the fertility goes with it. So I always use this dump truck example. It's the most simple illustration. So to remain eligible for federal programs in Iowa, NRCS requires annual soil loss to be below 5 tons per acre. Now let's take a 100-acre farm with 5 ton per acre soil loss, which is 500 tons of soil leaving the farm annually. A common dump truck capacity for a double rear axle is 10 to 15 tons. So a 500-ton loss on a 100-acre farm equates to over 30 dump trucks showing up annually to fill up and leave the farm. And, if anybody showed up doing that in Iowa, you might get met with some unfriendly neighbors out in the field. But really, the thickness of a dime across 1 acre equals 5 tons. So it's minimum when you think of it like that. Erosion is a cost to farmers in the loss of fertility and organic matter. Too often we apply more fertilizer or other crop inputs, masking the true impact of erosion. Higher expenses for the same yield means lower profits, which lowers the value of the asset. Erosion is a cost to landowners and decreased value of investment. Erosion is a cost to society in clogged roadway ditches, increased turbidity in public waters, displaced soil and water, increases siltation of water in control structures. We see the cost in taxes or in quality of society in general. The value of the topsoil is not great annually, but it is measurable and will have an impact over time. And at some point, losing a farm's topsoil will have a cost, and it will be, very difficult to replace it once it's gone. And this is a very quick overview of the landowner role in farmland stewardship. And I know we touched upon a lot of information. In the upcoming webinars, we'll dig deeper into these topics. And in the meantime, I'm happy to answer any questions, which I know all the other speakers today would be happy to do so with the time we have left.
Great. Thank you, Molly.
Yeah.
I want to thank our other speakers as well. I think Molly said it best. We've covered a lot of different things today. We're going to drill down into some of those specifics over our next workshop. So before we get to some questions here that are in the chat, I just want to provide an overview of kind of where we're going next. So next week, the workshop will focus on kind of agriculture 101 for the farmland owners. So what should you know about what your tenant is doing at different times of the year? What should you know about how your tenant is making decisions about how they farm and where they farm and when they farm? And then we'll also hear a bit more about some of the professional services that are out there for both farmers and landowners to help make some of those decisions and implement some of those practices. And then our third and fourth workshops are really about building that equitable and viable and long-term relationship with the tenant so that you can implement all of these various things and have a solid, steady return on your investment and appreciation of your, farmland asset. So that's kind of the overview of the workshop series. Like I said, I hope that you tune in to drill down into some of these topics with us. They're complex and complicated, and we're here to try and make it as simple as possible. So hopefully we didn't overwhelm anyone. We do have a few questions in the chat. I think we can answer some of these now, and then I'll just say too that if we refer you to one of the other workshops, we're not trying to pass the buck. We just want to make sure that we have time to cover the topic in depth. So Nathan asked a question a while ago. I can find it in the chat. Nathan asked, what is the one thing you'd like farmland owners to change in how their land is farmed for the benefit of the watershed they're located in? I think maybe Ted, your presentation spoke to that a little bit. I would say, Nathan, I think our third and fourth workshops especially will speak to that some more, but Ted or Molly or whomever, I don't know if somebody wants to take a shot at, if you had to pick one thing, what would you tell landowners?
I'll take a swing from the water utility perspective, at least. And what I would say is that we understand that one size doesn't fit all. Every single acre is different. But the one thing that we would like to see landowners do is to have a plan for how the nutrients, the inputs, the whatever is going to leave that land is going to be addressed before it gets to the surface waters in the state. And that could be any number of things, any number of practices that will help address those, but just to have a plan and know how that's going to be addressed.
Great. And we will cover, like I said, some of those more like tactical things, what some of those different options are and how to go about working with your tenant to implement them. Molly, you unmuted. I don't know, do you want to say anything there?
I loved what was said earlier about knowing your watershed address. I think just having, digging it into and having an understanding of how your farm sits on the landscape and how operation, decision-making, management plans on your farm affects the larger landscape.
Perfect. So I'm just going to kind of work my way through the chat here, and I may combine a couple of these questions. So Kate had a question about a deep water well and whether that deep water well might also have a water quality issue and how she might go about finding if there is a water quality issue. I think Jen shared some potential resources in the chat. I didn't know if anyone on our speaker panel here could speak to that a little bit. And it's really two questions, right? Are there deep water well water quality concerns? Maybe not the same water quality concerns. And then can we have it tested?
Yeah, every source of water has its own unique concerns. Deep wells have clearly different concerns than shallow wells or than surface water sources. But in terms of going about determining what those concerns might be, I'm not sure what resources Jen posted, but the DNR is always a great resource on what quality concerns might be. And then there's always the opportunity to have water tested. But if there are specific concerns or just general questions, I think I would probably start with reaching out to the Department of Natural Resources.
Ed, I did say that the Department of Public Health at the county level often has funds to do testing, and then the State Hygienic Laboratory also does testing. And There is a grants to counties program where counties get money from the Department of Public Health. So any one of those types of agencies they could contact.
Absolutely.
And Catherine also shared a link in the chat to the county sanitary in Alameda.
They go by different names, not always sanitarian or whatever. But yes, and it's free. And usually I just called for mine to be tested. And usually they do it on Monday and Tuesday because it goes to the University of Iowa to get the results, and you get your results back. There is a new program that also tests, not just, you have to ask for nitrate testing, at least here. And I asked if there was any way to test for phosphorus. They also have funds right at the moment for arsenic and magnesium, and both of which you want to pay attention to. I have a very shallow well, it might have been put in the 1930s. And I have it tested every year so that I have a baseline in case what's happening now had happened. We have a young man who thinks he wants to put hogs right close to the river here. So I want to know that it's not going to, it runs every direction towards me. So no matter which piece of his land he puts on. So, and you have to take the water. You can't block your tile and you can't block it over land. You have to take the water when you're downstream. Just like Ted and Jennifer know that they get what they get from upstream, and all of us are downstream from somewhere. You get what you get. Unless we all cooperate, it'll continue to be like it is. And we've just got to get more people on board.
I'm also going to chime in here. Thanks, Chris. You mentioned arsenic and manganese. In a deeper well, that is more of a concern. So you want to make sure you're doing that testing too. The yearly testing a lot of the times is only bacteria, nitrate when you request it. So you want to make sure you do those heavy metals because those can be a concern for the deeper.
I'm going to move on here. Marty asked the question, how is the Moines Water Works working with other utilities in the state to band together to either lobby the Iowa legislature, work with DNR, or get the word out to farm producers? And I think this is one of those things that the Moines Water Works is doing, right? This partnership on this workshop is one of the ways I think you're working to get that word out, not just to farm producers, but to farm landowners. So I don't know, really briefly, if somebody wants to summarize kind of what the Waterworks has planned.
Yeah, I will start by saying that's one of the reasons I reached out to Jen and asked her to come back to Des Moines Water Works when I got this job, and I'm going to ask her to summarize all of the things that she's doing very quickly.
In less than 30 seconds. This is one of the most exciting things we're working on, is to partner with uncommon collaborators, people that you might not expect Des Moines Water Works to be working with. So this is great. They're reaching new audiences with us and vice versa. Yes, the answer is yes. We work with elected officials all through the year at the state level to tell our story and tell them how hard it is to treat water with the water quality the way it is for 500,000 Iowans. We talk with people at the federal level. We met with Senator Grassley's team last week and Congresswoman Axney. And so we're always telling our stories about water quality and how, what can we do to help fix these problems? So the answer is yes, we do talk with elected officials. We do collaborate with people who share our values for clean water and public health. And then basically we just tell our story. We find it to be really powerful and try and seek out people that are wanting to work with us. So, the other thing is, I don't know if you saw it in the chat, but people think that nitrate is only a Des Moines Water Works problem. So we've discovered that there are 47 or 48 other drinking water utilities in Iowa who have to treat, I think Ted mentioned that, who have to treat or blend for nitrate. And so we are launching the idea of a nitrate collaborative where we can kind of create a community of public water systems in little towns and little rural communities who struggle with this, so they understand treatment methods. And we're going to hopefully talk about communication skills for how to talk with landowners and elected officials out in their communities about protecting source water. So that's not the only thing I do here in my job at Waterworks, but it's one of the most fun is to advocate for clean water.
Thanks, Jen. We didn't, Jen, maybe you should introduce yourself too. We should have probably started with that, but I don't think we introduced you.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Terry. I'm a dairy farm girl from Hardin County. I don't know that we have anybody, I haven't seen anybody pop up and mention Hardin County yet, but I'm an Iowa native. I went to law school, graduated 8 years ago, and I've been working on water quality policy ever since, either at the Iowa Environmental Council or here at Des Moines Water Works. And I'm thrilled to be back here. I've been back for about 10 months with Ted as the new CEO at Waterworks. And I'm so enjoying working with Jorgen and Molly and Ruth.
Sorry, I gotta find my place here in the chat again. Okay, maybe Chris, I'm gonna combine a couple questions here. Hopefully you can give us your perspective. There's a question about a crop share lease, how you split costs in a crop share lease. Maybe you can explain for us what a crop share lease is. And then maybe too, Chris, you can talk about if you do soil testing, how you and your tenant split those costs.
I'd be happy to address both of those things. Crop share is something that my dad always did. And he always said, if the farmer did well, you did well. If the farmer did poorly, you did poorly. And it balanced out. You both shared the risk. It's a 50-50 crop share where I put in half of the money for half the inputs. I get half the crop. I had to learn how to market my crop, not sell it all at harvest when it was at the lowest price, all those kind of things. I also had to be involved in knowing what it was we were buying and for seed and so forth and so on. So half and half. When cover crops first came in, and I think again now, there were quite a lot of incentives available at the NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation, USDA office. And I watched that a lot because 2 times now, my farmer is actually, and I call him my farmer, but he farms for his sister and he farms for himself and he farms for others. 2 times now, he's planted cover crops on his own land because he's seen it work on mine. And I've managed to get him not only the NRCS money, but PFI's special program for cover crop people. And the other thing I do is that I manage the cover crop part of the program myself. I don't pay for it all because he said he would pay, okay? But I know others who pay, landowners who pay for all of it the first year and a little less and a little less and a little less. But I pay for it all up front. And then at the end of the year, when we settle up, he buys the corn seed and I pay him. He does haying, he pays me for the hay or my share of it. Those kind of things. We settle up in December. Molly will have a fit about this. We don't have a written lease. We have a handshake and we do it in the combine. And he says, am I still on the list for next year? And I said, yeah, you know, he knows the history. I've cash rented. It's horrible to have the field outside your kitchen window be somebody else's and you can't even walk in it. And it's across the driveway. Crop share is the only way to go, my opinion. But I also know that financing it in the early years, financing it was a problem because I'd have to go to the bank and so would he. And the 2 years I cash rented, I didn't worry about anything except that I had a sick husband and a bazillion other things to do. It was way easier that way, but living here was different. Okay, so did I hit them both? Oh, soil testing. Soil
Yeah, real
testing,
quick.
we do I'd like to do it every 2. We get the yield maps. I have the soil maps, and I do it every 4 years. More often if we have some big change, but we've brought our organic matter up. You can see all of those kind of things every 4 years. And I offered to pay for all of them as well. And he said no, that he benefits from it also because he has to buy less fertilizer and less herbicide now. So that's it. That's how crop share works on it anyway, or how I do.
Yeah.
Sorry
Molly,
for being long-winded.
no, that was perfect. Molly, anything to add? I know crop share leases are kind of increasingly uncommon in Iowa. We have about 3 minutes, so anything to add there? And then there was a question in the chat about maps that show where tile lines are. I don't know if you would know of how landowners can go about locating tile, short of having someone come out and locate it.
Yeah, all great questions in the chat. I would agree with Chris that crop share is ideal for landowner tenant shared control over that farm and transparency. You get to know your farm, the ins and outs, and it's a real partnership with that farmer. That being said, you know, it works ideal for someone who can have that level of involvement, or if you live across the street. There's a lot of landowners that live across the state and across the country. It's just not, may not be feasible without someone boots on the ground, like a professional farm manager to help you. What I would say is that it doesn't mean a cash rent lease doesn't mean that you can't be actively engaged on your farm. And that's the power of a written lease. And even writing a sort of conservation addendum where you go line by line and it gives you discussion points and it gives you an action plan how to move forward on your farm every year. So even if you're in a position that you, it makes financially sense, time and resources to be a cash rent lease, still a tremendous opportunity to be involved and to participate in conservation and conservation work. For tile maps, my experience has been when I step onto a new farm and don't have any tile maps, talking with your tenant, with the farmer, and it's amazing what your farmer and the neighboring farmers know about the neighborhood. And this is a great opportunity to get to know your farmer and the neighbors. Sometimes those are recorded at the county, and even calling in and talking to the person in charge of drainage districts. I can't think of that title of that person's name, but you know, going on the county website and dialing into that person is just calling and asking questions. My experience has been always very friendly staff, willing to help, willing to explain, willing to send me maps if that person has anything on file. And then more times than not, there's a couple great tile contractors in the neighborhood that have out everybody's farm. And if you call, if you talk to your tenant, if you make those connections, more often than not, I will find myself talking to a contractor who can remember just in his head where he's tiled in the neighborhood and on the farm I'm working on. And, you know, just starting those conversations at a point of curiosity to better understand the landscape, not to point fingers, and to point out where, you know, a problem might be. Just wanting to learn more about your farm and the landscape. this gets you a wealth of knowledge from the people if you just show up and ask.
There are geomaps also available through US Geoservices, and you can actually see since the 30s forward what's happened in the land. And there's a, I don't remember who he is, but there's a great way of seeing if it's a wet year or a dry year. You can see the difference in the color of the aerial map from the satellite. What difference, where those tile lines are on your land and on the neighbor's land. I don't remember, Jorgen, which service it is that you're using to map things, but one of my neighbors just recently mapped the entire 4 square miles that we're looking at, and can tell you where there's tile just because of the way it looks from the sky.
Right. So those aren't necessarily tile maps, but you can see that tile in aerial images sometimes.
Right.
We're a couple minutes over. People have to hop off. I understand. I want to make sure we get to this last question. Rod asked, do we know the percentage of the 60% of non-operating landowners who are Iowa residents? I don't think we have a good breakdown of what that percentage looks like, except I want to say that most of them are actually Iowa residents. I think a large majority, vast majority of that 60% are in fact Iowa residents, which surprises some people, but they may not live in the same county, but they typically live in state or not too far away.
Alicia put a very good link in.
Yep. Okay, I think that is all the time we have. So I guess I better wrap things up. We are going to talk more specifics about how to build a farmland lease of different types and how to incorporate different practices into those leases in workshops 3 and 4. So if those are questions that persist, make sure that you tune in for those workshops. Otherwise, I want to say thanks again to all our speakers. Thanks to all our attendees for giving up your lunch hour. I hope to see you next week and the week after.